Hey everyone, and welcome to this explainer. Today we are absolutely kicking down the doors to one of ancient Greece's most fascinating and honestly, most heavily guarded secrets. We're stepping completely outside the historical mainstream for this one. So if you think you already know how ancient Athenian society worked, well, prepare to have your perspective entirely flipped. Let's get right into it.
So what exactly went down at ancient Greece's most secretive party? We are talking about the Haloa. This was a midwinter agricultural festival celebrated in the month of Poseidon, which roughly corresponds to our late December or early January. Now, this wasn't your typical quiet, solemn religious gathering. Not at all. It was an incredibly exclusive, all-night celebration. And when I say exclusive, I literally mean men were strictly, legally, and morally forbidden from attending the sacred rites. The legends surrounding these women-only festivals were intense. They warned of absolutely dire consequences, ranging from castration all the way to death for any man foolish enough to try and spy on the proceedings.
Okay, to really grasp why this is so mind-blowing, we have to understand the everyday reality for women in Athens. Ancient Athens was a fiercely patriarchal society. Women generally lacked legal personhood, they were totally confined to the domestic sphere, known as the oikos, and lived under the strict, constant authority of a male guardian. They couldn't vote, they couldn't hold office, and they were basically shut out of public life entirely. Keeping this extreme marginalization in mind is absolutely crucial because it highlights just how radical a state-sanctioned, women-only, completely unchaperoned all-night festival truly was. It was a total, unprecedented inversion of all their everyday rules.
Section 1. Gods of Wine and Wheat. Let's take a look at the deities of the Haloa.
The Haloa was at its core an agricultural festival. It was primarily focused on the first fruits of the harvest, honoring this really fascinating trio of deities. You've got Demeter, the great protector of the fruits of the earth. You've got Dionysus, the god of the grape and wine, obviously. And then we have a very specific, unique form of Poseidon known as Phytolmios, who was the god of shore vegetation and irrigation. The festival marked a super specific moment in the farming calendar, basically the successful completion of the autumn sowing of cereals, alongside the vital winter pruning of the vineyards and that first fermentation of the wine. So it was a time to coax out the harvest and simultaneously revel with the wine god.
And this brings us to what might be the supreme irony of the Haloa when we talk about gender roles. The festival required this massive, incredibly lavish banquet at the sanctuary of Eleusis, and guess who had to pay for the whole shebang? The men. Yep, male officials, known as archons, had this strict legal and moral expectation to fund the entire party. They had to buy massive amounts of firewood, provide all the wine, and literally set the tables for the feast. But the second the preparations were done, boom. They were immediately kicked out of the sanctuary. They literally had to go wait outside while the women engaged in the sacred secret rites inside.
Section 2. Feasts, Fertility, and Phalluses. Time to get into the secret rites themselves. So a massive central pillar of the Haloa was a practice called aistrologia. Basically, that translates to ritual obscenity. Safely locked away inside the sanctuary, the women were actively encouraged to behave terribly. They told incredibly saucy, crude jokes, shouted obscenities at one another, and gossiped about illicit love affairs. But why? Well, it wasn't just for fun, although I'm sure it was. It was actually agricultural magic. See, according to myth, when Demeter was deeply mourning the abduction of her daughter Persephone, an old servant named Yambe, or sometimes Baubo, used crude jokes and actual self-exposure to finally make the grieving goddess laugh. The women of the Haloa were reenacting this exact myth. They were using humor and sheer obscenity to cheer up the earth goddess so she would bless their fields with a massive harvest.
Now, the grand feast itself had some incredibly specific, strict dietary rules. They drank copious amounts of wine, of course, and ate civilized foods provided by Demeter, like cereals. But the forbidden list, it was intense. This was a completely bloodless festival, meaning absolutely no animal flesh was allowed. Zero. On top of that, pomegranates were strictly banned. Why pomegranates? Because they were considered dead man's food. It was literally the very fruit that bound Persephone to Hades down in the underworld. Apples, eggs, domestic fowl, and even certain types of fish, like red mullet and dogfish, were also completely off the menu to respect these deep, ancient religious taboos.
And those rules totally carried over into the physical symbols of the festival too. Right alongside the wine and cereals, the absolute centerpiece of the feast consisted of idodia cakes. These were literal pornographic pastries shaped like male and female genitalia, baked out of wheat dough, sesame, and honey. Just imagine that being the centerpiece at your next holiday party, right? The women would handle and eat these cakes while exchanging all those crude jokes we just talked about. Some traditions even involved burying these symbolic dough shapes in the ground to literally wake up the freezing winter soil for the coming spring.
The mythical origin for this one? There's a wild tale where Dionysus actually punished some shepherds with permanent erections, and the only cure was dedicating clay or dough models of genitals to the god.
Moving on to Section 3, Wives and Courtesans Unite. Let's talk about how the Haloa blurred some major social lines.
Normally, ancient Athenian society had these rigid, almost uncrossable boundaries between different classes of women. On one side, you had the citizen wives. These women were respectable, sure, but heavily confined to the home to ensure legitimate heirs for their husbands. On the totally opposite side, you had the hetera. These were higher-class prostitutes who were often highly educated, trained in music, and basically celebrated across the city for their wit and conversation. Normally, these two groups occupied totally different social stratospheres. They almost never mixed. But during the Haloa, those strict legal and social boundaries were completely and utterly erased.
In fact, historical records make it super clear that the heterai were not just permitted at the Haloa, they were a vital, functioning part of the whole machine. Because the ritual actually required uninhibited freedom of speech, crude joking, and this atmosphere of absolute raucous celebration, the witty, highly socially experienced heterai were perfectly suited to facilitate the mood. In the eyes of the cult, a woman's legal standing in the city outside the walls didn't matter one bit. What mattered was their shared female biology and their collective power to perform the agrarian magic needed to stimulate the earth. They were literally bonded by the ritual.
Section 4. Male myths versus female reality. Let's uncover the truth.
Here's the thing you have to remember. The historical record of this festival is heavily clouded by the male gaze. Just listen to this quote from a 13th century marginal note on the Roman writer Lucian. It describes the festival as involving pits, snakes, pigs, and models of genitalia, all of which have a more or less marked sexual significance. It sounds wild, right? But remember, almost everything written about the Haloa comes from men who, by law, never attended it. They literally sat outside the sanctuary walls, terrified, just imagining what in the world was happening in there. As a result, the accounts we have are often wildly sensationalized, focusing heavily on supposed debauchery, wild dancing, and rampant sexual license. Many scholars today actually believe these scandalous descriptions just reflect male anxiety. It was absolute terror at the thought of women possessing total autonomy, even for just one single night.
So, what is the actual truth? Well, the modern consensus pretty much strips away all those exaggerated male fantasies. The Haloa was absolutely not a debauched orgy. It was a highly structured, super important religious ritual utilizing ancient agricultural magic. But honestly, just as importantly, it acted as a vital social valve. It gave politically marginalized women a rare, completely state-sanctioned space for solidarity. It was this beautiful moment of communal joy where they could step completely outside patriarchal control, manage their own affairs for once, share their experiences, and foster a distinct, shared feminine consciousness.
Which leaves us with this final, really fascinating thought to ponder. The Haloa invites us to imagine a world where ancient women gathered together in the absolute dark of winter to celebrate life, fertility, and each other, completely free from the suffocating constraints of their everyday lives. So, how does that ancient need for private, liberating communal spaces echo in our world today? What modern equivalents do we have that serve this exact same purpose? Think about it. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive in today's Explainer, and I really hope this leaves you looking at ancient history in a completely new light.